graduated with a Master's of Engineering in Software Engineering from the Department of Computer Science at Aberystwyth University about 12 years ago, and worked in London for several years before emigrating to New Zealand. And he's talking to us from New Zealand this evening. So what on earth could go wrong? I hope nothing. So Darius has over 10 years of experience working in and leading agile teams, developing large-scale commercial applications in organizations which included the BBC and Sky. More recently, he's been leading a team applying modern engineering practices to re-architect how Trade Me engages with its customers. And so this evening, he's going to take us on a journey from senior developer to lead software engineer. So over to you. Oh, sorry, a bit of housekeeping. Please, can you keep your microphone muted and your video off, except when Darius asks for questions. He's going to sort of break his talk up into 3 sections and ask for questions in the end of each section. And then obviously at the end of the talk, we'll also ask for questions. You can put questions in the chat at any time. And I should point out that the talk is being recorded. It will be made available on the BCS YouTube channel in about a week's time. So over to you, Darius.
Thank you so much, Fred. Kia ora koutou, croeso pawb. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today to have a chat about lead software engineering and what it involves. Thanks for the introduction, Fred. Just to add a bit more context to that about, say, for example, what Trade Me is. So in case you're unfamiliar, so Trade Me is an auctions and classifieds website that's here in New Zealand, which is, you can imagine it as being similar to eBay and a couple of other similar websites like that. Yeah, and so the gist of my talk today, what I'm hoping that we're going to cover, our agenda is that first thing I'd like to do is talk to you about what a lead software engineer is in the first place, just to calibrate us all and get a mental image of that. And then I'd like to give a bit of context about why I feel this talk is important and the reason why I encourage other people to do similar talks as well. And then what I would like to do from there is share with you 3 tools that I've been learning in my early lead career that have been helping me with some of the challenges that I encounter. So the first one I'd like to talk about is a framework for how you communicate software architecture among teams and with your stakeholders. Then I'd like to talk about how you participate in crucial conversations, and I'll talk about what those involve. And finally, I'd like to talk about architectural decisions, why they're important, and a framework that you can use to help you make your way through those. And yeah, so as Fred was mentioning, what I'll do, I'll give the introduction, and then as I'm working through each of these frameworks, I'll pause for questions at the end of each sort of framework so that we can have like a general discussion for a couple of minutes, and then we'll do like a Q&A at the end in case anyone's got any other questions. So if that sounds good, let's get started. So what is an LSE anyway, or what is a lead software engineer? I like this definition from Pat Kua. If you haven't come across Pat Kua, he's a regular at a conference that I encourage you to have a look at on YouTube, which is called Lead Dev or Lead Dev Conf. And he's a thought leader in this tech lead space. And so he defines it as a tech lead is a software engineer responsible for leading a team and alignment of the technical direction. So pull out a couple of keywords there, right? So a tech lead, as opposed to another team lead that doesn't have a technical background, has had a software engineering background and is usually closer to the tools than some other leads that I've encountered, where, say, for example, you might have a team lead who is a scrum master or is a product owner who is actually leading the team. Tech lead specifically and lead software engineers, I'm referring to people who have come up through the experience of being a developer from junior through to senior and are still engaged in the technical direction of what's being built. And then, yeah, the other key aspect from this is that I would consider a lead software engineer to be someone who actually has one or many teams that they're leading, as opposed to, if you're thinking about the technical direction generally at a company, you are more likely to be something like a principal developer or an architect. And that's so the role that I'm emphasizing here. Now, why give a talk on being an LSE at all? A bit of history about my career. So as Fred mentioned at the start, so I graduated from Aber in 2012. My junior developer experience was at Cyngor Gwynedd in Carnarvon while I was at Aber. And then my first role out of university was with a startup called Psychic. Don't look it up. I think it's gone. Nothing to do with me, honest. Yeah, but anyway, so from there, sort of transitioned to the BBC and BBC Worldwide, and was working as an intermediate developer for a couple of years, and then to senior developer. A bit the technology I was working with. So when I left Aber, I was focused mainly on iOS development. And while working in my early jobs, I sort of transitioned, as you tend to being a full stack developer. You do what your company needs you to do. And that sort of became a real emphasis on cloud and front-end development by the time I was at the BBC. And that theme has sort of continued. Anyway, first team lead experience was when I joined Tradeline in 2019. And what I would say is my experience of this career progression is that for the journey from junior through to senior, you are building up like a set of skills around how to do software development. And so regardless of the tool set you're working in or the projects that you're working on, there are principles that are building up that are useful to you, regardless of which project you're working on. So you'll be learning the solid principles, you'll be learning what good code is. Like a good example that I refer to members of my team is that I don't know if you've had this experience when you pick up a new technology. The first hour or so is, how do I write a loop? How do I do a conditional? How do I do this? That mode of thinking is like building up within this part of your career. And it's going to be useful to you as you continue to go up in seniority. My experience, though, is that like as you transition into lead, there is a new sort of set of skills that builds up that you need to add on top of this. And the learning curve can be quite dramatic. And so it's useful to have like resources for you to be able to reach out to. So to map that out, like here, we've got what I would consider to be the skills of an LSE. Now, I formed this from my experiences working at Trainline, Sky, and then at TradeMe. There are, depending on which company you're in and how they consider a tech lead, there will be variations to this map. So say, for example, at my current company, we lead software engineers do not do people management. We have development managers who handle that. And so you emphasize more of the technical direction of the team and coaching and sponsoring your developers, but you don't do some of those things you would think of like traditionally managerial, like performance reviews and sort of like regular handling of HR matters and things like that. That's deferred to someone else. I have worked in places, though, where the tech lead takes responsibility for that as well. It will depend where you are. But anyway, so if we're following this map, you can see on the bottom right here, technical skill. A lot of that is the stuff that you have you are building now in your degrees, and what you will be building up during the path of your career from junior through to senior. So I've already mentioned a couple of things: solid principles, design patterns, how you do refactoring, unit testing, what good testing looks like, and how good code gets out into production. And then so from there, you open up into this new sort of two new key areas. So the first is architecture. And so one message I would emphasize to you is that there's a lot of mystique around the word architecture in technology. And so there's a tendency to, as soon as you talk about architecture, the tone becomes, oh, we're doing architecture today, don't you know? It's not quite like that. And surprisingly, what I found as I was growing in this area is that a lot of the same principles you've used when you were learning to code are important regardless of the scale of the application that you're working on. So a good example I can give you is the inversion of dependency principle within Solid. So I'm sure you'll have come across that, where you want to have your dependencies relying on contracts, and then you implement on those contracts rather than having tight coupling between your modules. That principle applies whether you're working with two classes interacting with each other, whether you're working with like enormous distributed systems and how they handle asynchronous communication. The same principle applies. Anyway, so architecture, you've got these aspects of system design, what disaster recovery looks like, how you document your design thinking, and like how you make decisions. And then the other area that you're looking to build is leadership, right? So it's these areas of how you lead the group of people through the challenges that you're trying to do. So as I mentioned, you might be doing people management, but even if you're not a manager, you'll be thinking about, how do I shape the culture of my team? How do I encourage my developers and grow them? How do I facilitate like groups of people, not just the developers that I'm working with, but our stakeholders, our other supporting teams like the designers, etc. Building that ability to work with people who don't necessarily always agree with each other in order to get to an outcome that you all want. Yeah, so that's a bit of a map of like what LSE looks like. Now, my experience sometimes of the guidance that's available for making this transition is similar to this picture that I've got here. The tutorials you can find for a lot of these topics will be step 1 here. So draw 2 circles. And then the actual putting this into practice is the second step of draw the rest of the owl. And so you can see here that like there is quite a lot of elaborate difference between steps 1 and 2. And that's one of the challenges that I found, particularly in my early lead career, is like that transition and like learning, honestly, by failing a lot, to be able to fill in some of this, right? And obviously you never get to a point of perfection, but this is the process that you need to do. And so the idea of this talk, and why I encourage others to do similar, is that I would like to continue to build this culture within tech lead, the industry, of let's add more circles onto this idea of how to draw an owl, right? So if all we've achieved today is that rather than just 2 circles and then an elaborate owl, we've got a peach with 2 feathers on it, then that will have been like a useful step for us to take. And that's my aim today. Cool. So let's get into the first tool that I found useful. So how do you communicate software architecture in a way that you can work with your developers on it, and you can also communicate it to your external stakeholders, and you can think about how to structure the work that you're doing? So first thing to say is, what's up with diagrams? And what I mean by that is so I will have had a similar development background to yourselves, where I was learning UML when I was at Aber, and have been learning like UML and associate tools during my early career. Now, these are really powerful and useful when you're examining and thinking through code, like problems which are close to the code. So whether it's a class diagram or a UML sequence diagram, you're thinking about, how do I solve a particular problem using these modules? But as you grow the scale of the problem, your experience can be is that the tool becomes quite unwieldy to use. And the example I can give is that if you haven't tried to draw a UML sequence diagram under time pressure yet, you will eventually, and you'll know what I mean. And so there's another challenge that comes up. Like, so the first is these tools can be quite unwieldy as they scale. The second is that I work with a lot of developers who have come from non-traditional backgrounds. So they haven't necessarily gone to university. They have either been enthusiastic coders who have developed their skills in their personal time, or they have come through a boot camp, for example, before they got their junior developer role. And so they haven't necessarily had that experience with like how to communicate software visually. And so you work with them to teach them. A lot of the time, my experience is that people can get really bogged down with UML on, am I drawing the diagram right? Am I using the right notation? Am I doing this the way I'm supposed to be doing it? And to be honest with you, the challenge I find with that is that ultimately, what are you trying to do? You're trying to convey meaning. If the tool's making it easy for you to convey meaning, brilliant. If the tool is making it hard for you to convey meaning, then it's actually limiting what you can do, and it actually puts people off. And so what I was looking for when I was looking at this framework is like, is there an easier way to communicate software architecture? Now, in order to deal with this challenge, you tend to revert to block diagrams. I can share this because I drew it and it's an absolute travesty. But so the challenges that come up with block diagrams is that obviously there are very few rules or conventions about how you should draw these. So a couple of challenges that come up is that, what level of abstraction should you be showing on a particular image? What notation should you be using so that whenever someone arrives at one of these diagrams, they can get acquainted really quickly and be able to get familiar. So what we want is a framework to be able to give us a simple set of rules we can apply in these sort of situations. And so what I've encountered is this convention, which is called the C4 model. So C4, 4 levels to your diagrams: context, container, component, and code. And I'm going to talk a bit about what the notation is and how this helps with some of those challenges that I was just talking about a moment ago. And the analogy I'll be using throughout is Google Maps. Now, I know that I would assume that all of us will be familiar with like the user experience with Google Maps. And so C4 diagrams work like Google Maps in that as you're at a high level, you have a low level of detail, but you can see all of the context. And as you move into one level deeper, you can see more detail, but only about a particular piece of what you're currently looking at. So if we look at context, so the highest level of the C4 model, the example I can give here is that we've got New Zealand up on Google World, right? So you can see here that New Zealand is composed of 2 islands. You might see a couple of other useful pieces of information, like you can see Auckland, the largest city, and you can see Wellington and a couple of other bits and bobs. You can see the Southern Alps, but you don't see any detail about what the key roads are, for example, in the country. You don't see any of the smaller cities and like where they're laid out. But you don't need that information in order to actually get started and to understand the overall layout of New Zealand. And so it hides that information away from you until you actually need it. In the C4 model, when we're thinking about software, context diagrams are about the systems. So they are the software systems that make up the overall solution. Yeah. The example we can see here on the right is that we have an individual who is interacting with the system, a person who is doing their banking. And then we have 3 systems. So we have the internet banking system, which we are paying attention to because we work on it. And then we have 2 external systems, a system for email and a mainframe that we're integrating with. Now, and you've got a bit of detail about what is the relationship between each of these entities, right? So you can see personal banking customer views account balances and make payments using. So you use this language in these diagrams, like this element, brief description of what it is, and then this is its relationship with the thing that it's pointing towards. Now, the useful thing about this is that if you want to introduce someone to a system that they haven't worked before, or you want to have a conversation with a key stakeholder who isn't necessarily technically doesn't have technical experience, you can bring this up because it's already part of your set of diagrams and use it to inform your discussion. You can use it as a map to inform the discussion. Yeah. So that's the first level of C4. Moving one level down though, because obviously we don't get too much detail from that. This is one level down where we've taken that internet banking system from the previous diagram and blown it out to add the containers which are within it, each of the individual applications that make up that system. Now, the analogy, again, going back to Google Maps, we've zoomed in on the North Island within New Zealand here now. And so you now start to see more detail emerge. So you can see the largest highways in the country. You can see a bit of detail about the Auckland metropolitan area, for example. You can see Lake Taupo in the middle of the island. You see more detail about what you're focusing on. You can't see anything from South Island because you're not focusing on it at the moment. And so this is one of the advantages that C4 gives you, like you can see on that banking diagram here. We add the detail, but only for the software system that we're currently focusing on. Yeah, so you can see our internet banking system is actually made up of a web application, a SPA, a mobile app, an API, and a database. And so we're using the same notation again, like the same structure of blocks, the same way of talking about the relationships between those blocks. We've gone one level of deeper, but only in one piece of the application. So the idea is that it can be a way to structure how you convey the architecture, but also it can encourage how you and your team think about your architecture. So say, for example, when we're considering the pieces of this internet banking system, we don't necessarily need or want to know the details of how that email system works. All we want to know is what are the contracts on it, and how do we interact with it? And so C4 encourages you to think about which system am I working in, and keep single responsibility principle, keep everything that is outside of it while you're thinking about it. One level deeper again. So now we're at the point of components. Analogy for the map is that we're looking at Wellington on Google Maps here, right? Now, what we've done here is we've taken the API application from the previous diagram we were looking at, and now we have the components which make up this application. So you can see we have several controllers and several service objects which are forming that application, right? Again, we're only talking about one particular piece of the application here. And so, again, it encourages you to think about what are my contracts between this API and the other applications. And I don't want to get bogged down in trying to think about how exactly the other applications are working. All I want to know is, how does my system interact, and how does this set of components within this container deliver that functionality? Yeah. And then finally, when you get down to the level of Street View, this is code or UML. So if you want to think through particularly valuable pieces of your application, if you've got a really important algorithm that you need to get right as part of your application, you get down to the level of code within C4, and you will draw UML diagrams, sequence diagrams, for example, to work through that problem. And so that would become part of this hierarchy of how you're communicating your application, right? Now, that's like the way that it encourages you to structure your work. And so, as you'll have seen, as I've done a quick breeze through of these, the notation for C4 is like incredibly simple. And one of the things I like about this is, going back to that scenario I was talking about, teaching someone who hasn't really done diagramming before, you can teach this notation to someone in 10 minutes. You have blocks, you have some conventions about how you name them, depending on which level you're currently talking about. You have a relationship between those blocks, and you separate out the idea of a database, because it tends to be really important in your distributed systems to be highlighting these. But that's pretty much it, like in terms of like what the rules of it are, right? Now, in practice, when you're doing this with your teams, what you tend to find is that your context and your container diagrams tend to be long living. Like, obviously, large systems change slowly over time. And so when you're talking about the context of an application, it's very likely that that's going to stay the same for several years. Containers is also very likely to stay the same for several years. And you might be adding containers on, but you're not necessarily fundamentally changing any of that layout. Now, when you get down to the level of components and code, that is likely to be changing much more often. And so what you tend to do is, because those diagrams begin to rot as soon as you have drawn them, you tend to focus more on using this tool at the higher levels of the hierarchy, and you only invest your effort on the lower levels of the hierarchy on high value pieces of functionality that you think are going to be long lived, right? So that's like one thing you need to think through when you're approaching C4 for these sort of architecture challenges. But yeah, that's like a quick breeze through of like this tool. This is an example here of how my teams have been using it for communication domain, which is the application that we focus on mostly. I won't go into too much detail with the individual blocks on here, because I don't think we need to illustrate the principle. But yeah, so in practice, it's a good way to not only make it possible for you to create a suite of documents to communicate, but also to encourage the way of thinking that you're looking for among your team. Cool. That's C4. I've talked for a little bit. Does anyone have any questions on that particular topic before we move on to the next?
So I've got a question, Darius. So you've clearly invested time and effort in having good, clearly drawn out diagrams. To what level do you mix it up with just the informal diagrams where you're just scribbling it on a board and or on a shared whiteboard and stuff? What balance do you find is helpful?
Yeah, great shout. So similar to yeah, exactly. What we tend to find is that at the point of component and code, that is almost very frequently, that will be just something that we doodle together on a whiteboard or on a lucid chart together in order to get an idea of what we're going to do. And then that diagram would very often be thrown away, right? So it's usually a tool for collaborating in order to solve an immediate problem, like these lower diagrams, right? The investment, as I was mentioning earlier, you get much more return on investment if you invest on those higher level hierarchy diagrams and keeping them up to date. And fortunately, as long as you do a bit of pre-thinking about how you structure it, those don't change often, right? And so they become what you might find is for some of these lower level ones, you might solve a problem with them, as I was saying. You might store it somewhere, but you would probably caveat it, and we tend to add notes on these diagrams saying like, this is likely to change. One of those agile principles about the best place to look for what the code is actually doing is the code itself. Yep. So when you get to the level of code level diagrams, as soon as you put that down on paper, whether you've done it on a whiteboard or whatever, as soon as that code changes, that diagram is out of date. And when in the past we have tried to keep these diagrams up to date, that takes a lot of effort to try and keep it. And so, yeah, like my recommendation to my team usually is that invest in the higher levels. For the lower levels, you use it to solve a particular problem and then save it if it's valuable, or just chuck it away. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Neil. Right. If there's no more questions, I'll move on to the next topic. Cool. Let's do it. So, crucial conversations, like a framework for how you hold these, right? Now, first things first is, what is a crucial conversation? Now, if you haven't read it, I would really recommend a book called Crucial Conversations, which I'll have a reference to at the end. It goes into a great deal of depth about this topic and has a lot of really useful advice. Their definition for a crucial conversation is a conversation between two or more people where the stakes are high, opinions vary, and emotions run strong, right? So you have those three elements to it. Now, when you start thinking about this, there are obvious things to come into mind, particularly if you're a people manager. Like, you can imagine you having to hold these sort of conversations, say, for example, when you're giving critical feedback to someone or when you're holding a performance review. But actually, these will happen to you. They'll be happening to you in day-to-day life to start with. But also, these will happen regardless of your level of seniority. The thing that tends to change is they happen more frequently as you become more senior and you're working with more people. And also the stakes might rise because depending on the outcomes of these, it can actually impact the direction of what the team is doing and what how you achieve what the business needs you to achieve. So a couple of examples I can give is that, so we've talked about sort of giving critical feedback to a colleague. Another example would be a fundamental disagreement between yourselves and another team or a stakeholder about how to achieve a particular objective. Another might be, for example, something has gone wrong. You're in the middle of an incident, like a system is down. You've been working for a couple of hours on trying to solve it, and everyone is feeling really low. And you need to work with the people around you to try and like relight the fire in order to get us like back on board. That would be another example of a crucial conversation, how you encourage people in those sort of difficult moments, right? So my advice, though, how you recognize a crucial conversation when it's either coming or when you are in the middle of one, is that the monkey inside you knows. And so what I mean by that is that you will know from whether it is your emotional state, like if you're listening to your emotional state, or it might manifest physically, whether it's like goosebumps, whether your mouth gets dry. It depends on who you are, how you react to when you start to feel an important conversation or tension building, or you can feel the emotion rising between other people, right? So you need to listen to yourself in order to be able to recognize when these things are happening. It is useful when you know it's coming so that you can actually do a bit of pre-thinking, but some of the time you might have to react in the moment because it will depend on when you notice it. And so when you run into these sort of conversations, you have to start with the only thing that you can actually control, which is you, because you can't actually control other people. You can only interact with them. And so this is the first piece of this framework that I'd encourage, that I have found really useful. It partly comes from the Crucial Conversations book about how to either do pre-thinking before one of these conversations. It's really useful if you know that you're going to have a difficult conversation, if you can get a piece of paper and think through these questions to yourself before you have that conversation. Or if you're in the midst of it, you try and take a breath to ask these questions of yourself while you're having it. So the questions are, first of all, what is the story I'm telling myself? And what I mean by that is you very likely have had that experience where depending on a scenario which is happening, you have built up a scenario in your head that explains what's going on. So say, for example, like when another person performs an action, you might ascribe motives to that action that you don't actually know are true. You are just applying those onto it, right? And so it's useful to actually examine what is the story I'm currently telling myself? What motives am I ascribing to this action? And the follow-on question from that is, what do I actually know? What are the facts that I've got that I can think through? And do those justify this story that I'm telling myself? So an example would be if you perceive that a member of your team is not pulling their weight for whatever reason, like you might ask yourself, well, what do the team's DORA metrics indicate? What does the metrics around like participation on GitLab indicate? Does the evidence actually back up what I'm concluding, or am I under an assumption that might not be true? Now, following questions from that is examining what is the outcome that I actually want? What do I really want from this conversation? And what do I not want to happen? So say, for example, depending on how you approach some of these difficult conversations, an outcome that you don't want would be you both walk away upset and you haven't solved the problem that you're actually trying to solve. The outcome that you actually want is that you have understood better why the behavior that you're seeing or the circumstances that you're in exist and what the best way to solve that is. So say, for example, if another team is dragging their feet around the pieces of work that they need to do that enable your team to achieve something, well, how would I behave working with that team if what I wanted is to actually speed up like what we're doing, rather than just vent and leave everyone in a worse state where we haven't actually solved the problem? And then the last two questions are, what does my behavior tell me my motives are? So say, for example, if you in our lower moments, we've all done it, you are getting snarky, or you're getting irritated, or you are approaching people not from a position of curiosity, but from a position of like accusation. Why is this thing not been done? Well, the question to ask yourself is like, what does that behavior tell me my motives are? Because that's what the other person will be drawing conclusions on. So you need to ask yourself those questions. And if I wanted what I actually want, how would I behave? So if I want the outcome that the other team and my team working together are going to get to the result that we need, I would probably behave in a different way, where I would be curious about what are the limitations or constraints that are making it difficult for you to do this work. Is there something we need to change around like what our ask is in order to make it easier for you to do it? Like how would I behave in order to achieve what I'm looking to achieve? And then the second part of this framework is state. This is how to actually have the conversation in the moment, like how to actually structure your speaking, like whether you're with one person or with many. The idea is your aim is to create shared understanding among you and other people, and not necessarily to directly confront. Like you're trying to create understanding so that you get to a point of, that's the actual problem. What can we do to solve that, right? And the way this framework works is that, so you start with share your facts, right? So I was referring earlier to the difference between like what you actually know and what story you're telling yourself. what you want to do early on in these conversations, and you'll keep looping back through this framework, is stating only what you actually know to be fact. So if it's like a metric that concerns you, if it is a behavior that you have directly observed yourself and can say, for example, I have noticed that you haven't been participating as much in this weekly stand-up, like, and you can actually, you know that that's the truth because you've observed it. You speak in that sort of language, like, this is one of the things that I have observed. You then tell your story. You don't couple these two things together. You say, I have observed this. This makes me concerned that, and then you might add your own interpretation. Like, one of the things that worries me about this, if you're not participating in the stand-up as much as you have been, I worry that either we're not working on the right thing, or there might be distractions that are making it hard for you to engage, or I'm worried that you are just not engaged in what we're working in, and I want to understand more. So facts first, interpretations second, and you don't couple the two things to each other and state story as if it's fact, right? And the last bit of actually how you talk is ask for others' paths. So you need to state what you've observed, state your story and label it as your story, and then say, but I may very well be wrong. Can you tell me more about where you see this scenario in order for me to understand better? Like, what is the circumstances you're under? And you might find, for example, that scenario is just saying where a person is not participating in stand-up as much as you'd expect. There might be something going on at home that is distracting them from their work. There might be asks that they're getting from outside the team that mean that it's hard for them to focus on what they're doing at the moment. And if you give the space for people to talk about that, you actually realize that a lot of the time, the stories you tell yourself are completely wrong because you didn't have all the facts, right? And so you're trying to encourage that to happen. Lastly, T&E, so talk tentatively and encouraging testing. These are how you should actually speak, like, rather than how you structure the conversation. So talking tentatively, you try to, particularly when you're talking in stories, encourage testing, kind of go, this is one of the things that I am worried about or I am interpreting, but I may very well be wrong. What do you think about this situation? What sort of scenario have you got? And so the idea is to sort of build the shared understanding. Cool. I hope that makes sense, like, in terms of like how to at least create a set of rules for how you, obviously, the other part of this is you are not going to create a framework where every conversation you go into, you know exactly how to structure it, and you're always going to come out with the outcome that you want. And Brené Brown's book, Dare to Lead, has this really great concept, which is called rumbling with vulnerability. The idea of this is that the only way to participate genuinely in these crucial conversations and get to good outcomes is that you need to take your armor off, you need to be vulnerable, and you need to be willing to be wrong. And you will be wrong a lot of the time. And so that's one of the principles that you need to keep in mind. You can learn how to make it easier for you to work through these in a way that sort of has productive conversation, but it's always going to be difficult. And so it's one of the things you need to think through. Cool. So that's crucial conversations and like the state model for how you might structure these. Does anyone have any questions on that? I think I'm over time as well. I am. Cool. Thoughts? Easy peasy. I'll move on then. Cool. Last one. So a tool for making technical decisions. So I like this quote about what is architecture from Grady Booch. So architecture represents the significant design decisions that shape a system, where significant is measured by the cost of change. And the important bit of that is their cost of change. So obviously, when you're making decisions about the direction of the system that you and your team work on, the most important thing you want to be doing is thinking about, based on this option that I'm choosing, is it, one, achieving what we need to achieve now, and two, what options are closed off to us or become very difficult for us in the future based on that decision? Yeah. And that's if we boiled architecture, that topic I was talking about at the start, into one sentence, that is it. It's like how you think, and you encourage your teams to think about what the cost of change is. And like, whether you're willing to accept it, because there's always going to be a compromise with these things. Now, what's the consequences of bad decisions? And so the answer is it depends. The best examples I can give, like there's some good sort of definitions out there. I'm sure most of you have come across the concept of big ball of mud while you've been at uni. A lot of these larger systems, if you're making one bad decision, like unless it's a really bad decision, is not going to completely doom an application, right? So like software systems can absorb like small numbers of bad decisions, right? But what you tend to do is they accumulate. So if you're making lots of small bad decisions over time, if you're compromising a lot on like the direction of the quality of the code, if you're cutting off options, which actually with a little bit more work, you would be able to keep them open, then systems tend to devolve to a ball of mud. And so that's like the consequence that you tend to get, is that it becomes harder and harder to make changes to the system because of these accumulated bad decisions. And I prove nothing. I like this definition of big ball of mud that I came across recently. So you reach for the banana and you get the entire gorilla. So you can imagine this analogy, right? Of like you're trying to work with just a single service, but suddenly you have to know about an entire section of this application just in order to integrate with a particular module. Like, and I like this idea of like I just want the banana, dude. I don't want to work with the gorilla at all. Anyway, so a framework for how you make these decisions, right? So how do you think through these decisions? Now, this is a diagram of a TradeMe. What we use is called an architecture decision record framework that you can go and look up. And there's really good documentation about this on AWS and GCP's sort of guidance. The idea behind it is to highlight the things you need to consider when you're considering a question and the decision. So I'll breeze through these really quickly, and I'll recommend some resources afterwards for you to have a look. But so the things you need to think about when you're making the decision. So first of all is that what assumptions am I making about the circumstances? So the example I'm going to give here is whether a particular system should integrate with our system or should re-implement pieces of what we've done. So an assumption you might make in that decision would be, can our system support what this new integrator wants to do? I'm going to assume yes. I might also assume that the team has resources available to actually do that work. I might also assume that this aligns with TradeMe's overall technical strategy. And I would sort of be looking to highlight those and think about those assumptions before making a decision. Forces and factors would be the things outside of your control which would inform which direction you should probably go in on this decision. So an example might be, is the project under time constraints, and therefore it would force you in a particular decision direction? Or is there a contract which is expiring, which you, again, do not have control over, that you need to consider in how you make a particular decision in a particular direction? Constraints would be if there are, whether there are policy rules at your business around like how you need to go about this particular decision, or it could be that you have resource constraints, for example. Say, for example, you are deciding between whether to host your system on premises or you're going to use GCP. And you know that you have a budget constraint on this application that you need to build. Well, that would likely lead you down the direction of going, well, if we host it on GCP or AWS, then we can scale based on demand and set rules around how much budget we can actually use for this system. So you would consider the constraints when you're making the decision. And then lastly, it's the alternatives you've considered. And I like I saw a description of this the other day that said, like, if you haven't considered at least 2 alternatives before you made a decision, you haven't actually made a decision. You went, we're going to do this, and then you came up with a justification for why you're going to do it, right? So one of the things to think about when you're making decisions is that what are the alternatives that we could go down? And then from there, based on the assumptions, forces, and constraints, which is the best alternative for the direction that we're trying to go? Yeah. And then finally, you want to be thinking about the consequences of that decision. So, and we tend to think of consequences as always being negative, but actually they can be positive as well. So if I jump forward to an example here, I'm not going to dive through all the individual pieces of this, but so a consequence of should a new project send emails through our communication domain or communicate directly with our email provider? The decision of them integrating with us, the consequences would be for my team, communication domain, and for this integrated team, where a consequence would be we need to do work to enable this integration. But we also make it easier for us to observe all email traffic that's making its way into and out of TradeMe. From the other team's point of view, the consequences would be the solution is more aligned with TradeMe's technical direction and strategy. They're saved the effort of doing it, but now the delivery of their project is dependent on us being available to do that work for them. So you can see how the consequences of a decision have positive and negative outcomes that you need to consider. Cool. Now, am I saying that I draw that diagram out every time we're making an architecture decision? No, of course not. The idea behind that diagram is that it is a set of training wheels, like particularly when you're teaching intermediate and senior developers how to think through these around like how to consider whether their decision is a good one. And so from there, you tend to then revert to our technical one pages and our architecture decision records will be structured so that each of the sections goes like, here's your decision, like, what is your question? What are the forces you've considered? What are the consequences, etc. So that you are structuring your argument like that. You don't have to draw these diagrams every time you do it. But the advantage you get from this is that it's a way to structure your thinking, like particularly when you're working through large scale problems where you might need to make several key decisions while you're thinking through the direction you're going to take. If you break it down into individual decisions and think through that framework for each individual decision, it can make it easier for you to have confidence that you're going in the right direction. Cool. Any questions on that before I wrap up?
Everyone is very quiet.
All good. Mic drop. I'll see if we've got any in the Q&A when we finish up. Yeah.
And at the moment.
All good. So, in conclusion, like wrapping this up, like I've talked through 3 tools here today, right, that have been useful in my early sort of tech lead career. Now, obviously, this is not an exhaustive list of like how to be a lead software engineer. It's a couple of tools that I've been finding really useful. The really useful principle, though, and it's similar. You're at uni now. It'll be similar in your early jobs, and it just continues as growth mindset, right? Kendo, a sport that's close to my heart, has this principle of like fall down 7 times and stand up 8. And so, like one of the things you're going to need to grow is this skill to be able to keep getting it wrong, learning, and keep growing, right? And so the when the wins come, they are really great. So examples would be like when the outcomes of a hackathon that you have been organizing are being delivered and are being shared by the teams that were participating in it. When you feel flow happening among the team around you, like because of the work that you've done together to build up the culture of that team and like how you work together. Like this continuous like learning from like where you fall short makes it easy for you to build up these tools as you go. Yeah. And so I've talked a bit today about like 3 tools that I have found really useful in my early career as a lead software engineer. There are many more out there. And so these are a couple of my formative books, like while I was making this career transition. So I would pull out a couple of these, but I'll make sure that the slides are available afterwards so you can have a look. Dare to Lead by Brené Brown is an excellent book, and I recommend you to read it like right now. If you haven't. The Phoenix Project, Crucial Conversations, and then obviously there's documentation for the C4 model. If you Google it, you'll find it immediately, and there's heaps of guidance online about how to use that. And then a couple other here now. So say, for example, the DevOps Handbook and the Manager's Path. you may not be considering you may not be considering a career in management. You might not be particularly interested in people management. Some of these books, though, can be really helpful for just building up a set of knowledge about how to interact with people that is useful regardless of whether you're an individual contributor or not. Yeah. And so lastly, what I would highlight from here is that if you take nothing from my talk, and one action I can encourage you to do, there is a mailing list out there that's run by Pat Kua, who I mentioned at the start, called Level Up, which is on the bottom right there. Now, the way that mailing list works is that every week, Pat sends out an email. The first section of it is that he gives a reflection on a particular challenge or problem that tends to come up as a tech lead, and gives almost like a call to action, like a thing you should think about this week. Like, how would I do this? Or like, what can I do to make myself better at this? Then it boils down for like a couple of different topics, like architecture, technology, people leadership, the most useful and interesting stuff that's come up in the blogosphere during that week. And so it's a good way of just getting a single, if you only read one set of stuff for this week, if you get through that list, it's really useful. So I really encourage you to have a look at that. So finishing up, as I said at the start, and as I've just highlighted, these 3 tools are not an exhaustive list about how to be an LSE, but I'm hoping that by talking about this stuff, I've been able to at least fill in a couple of circles on this owl diagram. And what I would encourage you to do in your early careers now, once you have graduated, is that you look for opportunities to be sharing what you're learning as well, so that we can cumulatively build up this diagram and help others along the path. And I think that's it. Thank you so much for your attention. If you've got any questions, hit me up.
Okay, thank you very much, Darius. Just to point out before we go to questions, if you're not a member of the BCS and want to join, there's a discount code which I've put in the chat, which gives you £20, 20% discount for the first year. And also, Neil has put in the chat a link to a feedback form. We'd really appreciate your feedback on this talk. So any questions, either put them in the chat, or you can unmute and ask them, or put your hand up. And just perhaps if I could start, things often go wrong with large software systems. What do you do? What's the most important thing to do when things are going pear-shaped?
That's a great question, Fred. Tell you what, I can in fact, yeah, this is a good way of answering this. So what I found really useful is the more proactivity you've put into how you're going to respond to these problems when things go pear-shaped, the easier things are for you when it actually is, right? So you tend to, when things do go pear-shaped, it's usually raised as an incident at Trade Me in most places that I've worked, and that incident would have a severity on it, ranging from Sev 1 through to Sev 3, typically. But so what we find really useful in those sort of scenarios is, firstly, that we have observability in place on the system so that we can actually understand what is happening. And if we achieve nothing else when we're building new systems, we tend to try and aim for what's called the golden signals in Google's parlance for how you do observability. So those are, you want to measure on a system of like, how much traffic is going to it? How many errors is it throwing? What is the latency of that traffic? And from there, what is the saturation of the system? So how busy is it? How broken is it? How long is it taking to do things? And have I used up all my resources because of those 3 factors, right? And so when things are going completely pear-shaped, if you have dashboards available in New Relic or whatever tool you're using that make it possible for you to see those and some reliable logs about what the errors are, it gets much simpler for you to be able to work through these. And one other recommendation I would make that we've been building a practice of recently, and it's been really helpful. like my team and I have recently released a new feature called favorite push, so for push notifications for our customers. And we've been trying to build a practice of incident modeling. And what I mean by that is, before the product goes live, you have a session together where you go, what are the likely things that could go wrong with this system? And what would we do with each of those things if it happened? And it doesn't need to be elaborate and like a huge battle plan for everything that's going to go wrong. But so what was really helpful during that session is that we talked through a couple of likely scenarios, and we had an idea of what we would do, so that when or if that occurs, we wouldn't be scrambling in the first hour or so to understand like what we're going to do in order to solve the problem. So we had like a bit of a plan in place. And another recommendation I've seen, which I found really helpful, is, and this is something practical that you can take away, particularly in your early careers, is it can be useful to do incident modeling when you're writing your exceptions in your code. So when you write your exceptions and they're going to go to a logger, it can be useful to think about, if I see this error log in thousands of other errors, what is currently going wrong in the system and what information would I likely want to know? So rather than just saying this is broken, you might go, this is broken, the current customer ID is this, the current context of the request is this. And so it makes it possible to forward think about when things have gone pear-shaped, as you were describing, Fred, what information would make future me more comfortable that I actually understand what's happening. Yeah. So as much as possible, my answer to your question is that the more forward thinking you can do on this stuff, the easier it is when the proverbial fan is hit. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. John has asked whether the slides will be distributed. Yes, the talk is being recorded. The recording will show the slides and the audio, and that will be made available in about a week's time on the BCS YouTube channel, and you should all be sent a link to the recording when it's available. The BCS do some work to top and tail it and present it in BCS format, so to speak, and you should receive that link in about a week's time. Incidentally, there are lots of interesting talks on the BCS YouTube channel. If you're not familiar with that channel, I do suggest you have a look. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm just seeing one now. I'll read it out. Thanks for the question, Gloria. So you mentioned there was a steep learning curve for your first tech lead role. Could you please share a bit more about this experience? What was the hardest thing and how did you come? Yeah, okay, great question. I think my experience with my first tech lead role is that one of the things I didn't really address much during this talk, because it's a really broad topic and we need to think carefully about it, is burnout. And so my experience in my first tech lead role was that my feeling, at least, was that you need to know everything that's going on and have full detail of everything that's going on. And that isn't actually feasibly possible, right? And so my first tech lead role, like for the first couple of months, I would almost describe it as a process of letting go and trusting the people around you to own pieces of it, right? And so that very much, that isn't sort of a thing that you read in a book. It's a thing that you keep making mistakes and you learn, right? And so that was the key thing, particularly in my time at Trainline when I was in my first role. I think the thing to work through in that learning curve is that you can't control everything that's going on, and you can't know everything that's going on. You need to think at a different scope of detail about what is the overall context and are we working in the right direction, and trust the people around you to own the detail, right? So great example would be some of those architecture things we talked about today. in C4. By the time you're getting down to component, you're working with your senior developers to define what the structure of that application looks like. Once you get down to the level of code, you might work with your senior developers on like really gnarly pieces of like that algorithm, but also they are really capable people. And so you have to learn to like let go and let them do it, right? I'd say that, Gloria, was like the biggest challenge that I had was that idea that because you get so used to as an individual contributor that like you are abreast of all the detail and are able to sort of contribute to everything that's going on, you need to learn like what is the unique contribution that you're making that others can't do. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Okay, there's another question. Where can I find the diagram shown at the beginning of the presentation?
Which one? So what I can do is I can export the slides as a PDF afterwards and send it to either Neil or Fred, and they can share it around. Like, I'm happy to do that. There's a couple more questions coming through as well.
Yeah.
How can one improve their system design skills? Practice, Jane. I think there's a couple of really good resources out there that you can have a look at. If you haven't come across Uncle Bob or Bob Martin, he wrote 2 books, one called Clean Code and another called Clean Architecture, that I recommend you have a look at. But he also produced a really good video series quite a long time ago now that presents good system design in a humorous way. And I would really recommend, what I can do is, I know it's available on the O'Reilly website and a couple of other places. Like, what I might do is, Neil and Fred, I might send a couple more resources your way with the PDF. And if you don't mind sharing those around, I'd really recommend you have a look at those, Jane. And yeah, as I said, the other one is practice. And as I was mentioning earlier on, some of the principles you've already learned around how to write software, like when you're working on individual applications, they continue to apply as you scale up the problems that you're solving, right? So if you're keeping in mind things like dry, solid, etc., and regardless of like the project that you're doing, just keep that thinking in your mind about like, what does good look like? It can help you. And so my last thing is that by practicing, you will move towards getting better and better. You are going to design systems that when you look back at them in a couple of years' time, you'll go, like that could have been better. But actually, I would argue that if you're not doing that regularly, then like clearly you're not growing, right? So I think it is a fact that like practice, Jane, you'll get there. Yeah. Cool. How much system design skills should I know to land a junior software engineering role? Good question. So it can be useful to know a bit about it. So my experience would be when I was doing the MEng at Aber. So keep in mind, my advice is 12 years old. So things may have changed in Britain. It was useful to know a bit, for example, about messaging queues and how distributed systems communicate with each other. But honestly, to land a junior development role, I would be really surprised if you were being asked for details about how that system works. You would obviously will depend on the role that you're aiming for and whether you're specialized, like whether you're aiming for full stack developer, whether you're aiming for like a platform oriented role, such as like iOS or Android, or you're looking at DevOps. But so I would say that the most important things in system design skills for you in a junior developer role is that you know some of the principles you'll have been doing at Aber around like how do I modularize my code and create clean contracts in my code for others to be able to integrate with. And particularly the thing that will come up a lot, my experience at least is that over 50% of IT is APIs. And if you've learned to design good, restful, clean APIs, that's a really useful skill to have, like in your first junior role. Yeah, I hope that's useful, Luai. Like that, I wouldn't say you need to become like a master. When we were looking at those C4 diagrams, I wouldn't expect you as a junior developer to be like thinking in like distributed systems in major detail. That builds as you go through your career. Yeah. Cool. Thanks, Gloria. How do you approach hard deadlines in a project? Is it possible to honor these? Yeah, great question. So I don't know whether in your course you've been if you've talked about thin slicing at all. So it's a practice that comes from sort of agile and product world. But the idea behind it is that when you're thinking through hard deadlines, what you the thing that you might have seen these triangles that are around like compromising on either quality time and the amount of effort and how much sort of like overtime you do, or the amount of features that you can deliver. The idea behind thin slicing is that when you define a project, you should think about what is the most impactful piece of customer value we can deliver within the shortest time, right? So when you are looking at like a deadline for a project, the first thing I would be doing with my team is going, we probably can't deliver the whole project in one go. What is the piece of this project that if we delivered it, we would, one, get customer value, like we'd get something into people's hands that they can start to use, and two, that we could start learning from it. Like, because if you think in a traditional waterfall project, or you can actually get this in agile projects as well, you work in an agile way, but the whole thing needs to be ready before you can put it into production. The problem with that is that you're not learning, like you're not actually putting it into customers' hands so you can see whether they use it or not. There's a really good, hang on, that's it. Lean UX is a really good book I would recommend for this. The idea behind it is that you want to try and continuously deliver, right? So you want to try and find like, what is the smallest feature of this thing that I can create a reliable feature and deliver it? And so then continuously add more on top of it. And so you might get to a point where the deadline comes, you haven't achieved everything that your stakeholder asked for, but you've got 80% of the way there, and you've realized the last 20% was not actually valuable because customers didn't want it in the first place, right? So that's my advice around that with hard deadlines for when you get into industry. You want to be aiming for like, how completely brand new project, how do I deliver immediately and as quickly as possible into customers' hands, and then start to build up on it. An analogy you can use is like, if you're building a personal website, get a really ugly basic version of it shipping into prod immediately, and then like add bells and whistles onto it. Don't necessarily try and get it perfect the first time. I hope that's useful, Gustav. Dav, Uncle Bob could be quite dogmatic. I'd also recommend responsibility-driven design because she has a lot of stuff to say. Oh, good. Thanks for the recommendation, Dav. I'll have a look at that one. I get what you mean, that Bob can be dogmatic, and like I guess the onus on us all when we're reading or like when we're looking at resources is to take what we find valuable and to apply critical thinking to these things, right? So none of these resources that we recommend are gospel. The idea behind them is that we look for useful ideas and use them. And I love that you've recommended one. I can have a look at that afterwards. Thank you. If I may ask another question, how did you find out about all these tools? Any tips on how to form a habit of continuous professional development? Good question. So in terms of forming a habit of continuous professional development, the thing that I have found useful is, so TradeMe, for example, has a clause that allows 10% of your time to be used for personal development. And I don't know whether it's the case in all companies in the UK, but certainly a lot of places now are encouraging this culture of like, allowing people time to invest in themselves because it makes it easier for them to be able to do their work. Hang on a second. The dog's getting antsy. Yeah, so the first would be like, if your workplace provides it, funnily enough, my experience sometimes is that people don't take it. They don't use this 10% time. They kind of go, oh, I don't know what to do. I'm not sure. I've got too much to do on my plate. And so if your company is providing that, I would say grab it with both hands and clutch it to you and like use it all the time, right? The other tip I would give you, Gloria, is that a lot of the learning I find happens on the job. And what I mean by that is you encounter situations that you don't quite know how to solve, and you need to go away and like think about it and like learn in order to be able to solve it. And most of the learning that I've done over the years, I've had to build this mindset of kind of going like, well, I don't quite know how to do this right now, but I'm going to go away and learn how to do it, or I'm going to work with other people to work out how to do it. And so learning tends to happen while you're in the fray. Once you're in work, is my experience, at least. Yeah, I hope that's useful. Yeah, DAF, MVP, yeah, minimal viable product. Like that's another expression of it. Cool. That looks like all our questions. Does anyone have any closing thoughts or anything else?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Darius. That was a very inspiring talk, and obviously provoked a lot of questions and answers. And thank you for getting up early to join us from the other side of the world. So thank you.
No worries. Thank you so much for inviting me. And like, yeah, to all of you, like if you have finished your course and you're starting to look for work, I wish you all the best. Looking out there and like, yeah, like I said, just continue learning once you've finished, and like you'll do great. Like, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Darius. That's great.
Take care, folks. Have a great day.